Good morning, everyone. This is Stephanie Henry at the Tennessee Coalition. How are you? Well, hoping everybody is doing well. I wanted to get you're here this morning, and thank you for joining me to have a webinar about working with immigrant clients and limited English proficient victims and survivors. This is my first webinar, so everybody please bear with me. I've got Heather here who is actually helping me out this morning. A couple of technical things that we want to get out of the way before we get started. So the first thing is, if you guys have any questions, comments, or anything, please go ahead and make sure that you type it in the chat box. And we'll try and make sure that we keep an eye on that and can get to anybody's questions or comments. And I will make sure to leave some time at the end for questions and comments. All right, so to get started, what my goal is today and what I'm hoping to do is to do something that I would have found helpful for myself when I first started. And that's just to think about some tips and tricks and things that would have helped me when I first started, or things that I've learned along the way as I've been doing this. And just a quick background on me, I am an immigration attorney, and I have been doing domestic violence and sexual assault-based immigration for 10 years. So I've been working with immigrants for 10 years here at the Coalition. And I've learned a lot of good tips and tricks along the way, and so I'm hoping that I will be able to impart some of that to you guys. You know, quick legal overview. I know you guys have probably all attended a Title VI and Title IX trainings, and I'm not going to spend, you know, a lot of time just going through the specifics and the intimate details about that and about the law. But I did want to take a minute and, you know, just go over it briefly. And so one of the things that is important to remember is about Title VI and the prohibitions of, you know, discriminating against anyone when you're receiving federal funds. And one of the things that it requires is that you provide, you know, reasonable and meaningful language access. And one of the things that I think about when I'm dealing with limited English proficient individuals and thinking about reasonableness and meaningfulness is I think that the terms are intentionally vague so that it can give those that are receiving federal funds some flexibility in how they make it work in their programs or their jurisdictions or their communities. And so, you know, I think that's one of the things that, you know, as you're looking at how are you going to deal with immigrant clients that you may be serving, you know, that's one of the things that you keep in mind is that it needs to be something that's reasonable, but also meaningful. And the U.S. Department of Justice did provide or does provide some good assistance or guidance factors that can help you in determining what's reasonable or what's meaningful access. And we will actually touch on a few of these as we go through, but it'll be in a little different way than you may have been expecting. But it is something that I think as you're going through, it's something to think about for your programs and whether you're in a shelter or some other type of program, it's just going to be something that you guys should go ahead and start thinking about. So one of the things that was interesting to me was, you know, Tennessee's immigrant population has exploded in the last decade. We're one of the fastest growing immigrant populations in the country. Nashville is one of the fastest growing in the country. And you guys are the best source to learn and to know about who is in your community and what is best going to help those that are in your community. And so in preparing for this, I decided to look at what were the top languages that are spoken in Davidson County. And for the fact that I've been doing this for 10 years, I was surprised. I thought it would be Spanish, Arabic, and Kurdish. I was surprised to know that the third most popular language spoken in Davidson County is Vietnamese. So even as I was preparing for this webinar today, I learned something new. But when you're looking at information like this, and where I got this information is a great place that I think you guys can all go to, which is the American Community Survey, and that's part of the census that's done. And when you look at the community survey, this goes back to when the Department of Justice, the factors, when they're talking about service population and frequency, this is where you can get an idea of what your community looks like. The surveys are really great in telling you about who's in your community, who's in your county. If you've got more than one county, you know, you can go ahead and look at that information and find out what's going on where you live. And as you're thinking about those things, you know, some other things that you can consider are things such as, does your community have a permanent or a temporary immigrant population? So are you in a rural area that has a large agricultural population and maybe they're transient and they move around? Or is it a consistent year-round population? Or are you in a large university community? So, you know, you've got a lot of folks who may be there from, you know, August to May or June, but then most of them are gone during the summer and going home during the summer. And so when you know that information, that can help you guys to look towards the future of what needs that you may have. So you can learn about the languages that they speak. You know, other things that come up that we may not think about are, you know, what languages do you hear when you're in the grocery store? Are there other churches in your community? If you've got children and you're picking up your kids from school, you know, do you notice any other languages that you're hearing people speak when you are at school? So there are some great tools that are available to help you kind of figure out who's in your area and what might be something good for you guys to look forward to for the future. As you're trying to decide how you're going to service, you know, immigrant victims, immigrant survivors in your area, if they ever come to your programs or your organizations. Okay. And I'm just checking to see if we've got any questions. All right, so one of the other things that I've learned in doing this is, for example, if you're looking at that community survey can help you to not wait to have a plan. If you have an idea of the top languages in your area, it gives you the opportunity and the availability of having a few things available. And so, you know, just for example that I put up here, if you're at a shelter and you know that you have a large Hispanic community that you might be dealing with, it might be worthwhile for you to have your house rules just in Spanish and have them laminated and have them ready so that if you do have a Hispanic survivor that comes to your program, you've already got something that's ready and available for them. And this is, you know, this is a just in case plan. I think one of the things that I've also realized as I've been doing this is that you can't plan for everything, and that's okay. And you just do the best that you can. I think I have learned that having some introductory phrases can really be good to break the ice with clients that I've worked with, and helping them. My clients have really appreciated when I've attempted to speak their language, even if it's just something basic, or even when I got it horribly wrong. And there have been a few times that I have confused some of my words, and what I meant was truly not what came out on the other side. But my clients have been gracious about it, and they've laughed about it, and they've just appreciated that I took the effort to try and say something basic to them in their language to make them a little bit more comfortable. One of the tools that, I found and that I think, could be helpful is, and I've put it on the website here, on the webinar, is going to Health Translations. And this is, it's actually an Australian website, but what you can do is go on the website and you can, once you know like the predominant languages in your area, you can go on the website and create a cheat sheet of what's my language, what's my name, and you can print this cheat sheet and you can have it available, or it can be a something to help people identify what their languages are. So particularly if you've ever seen some languages that are written, such as Arabic or Kurdish, if you don't speak those languages, they can often look very similar. And so you can set it up where you can have a variety of these languages. And if you come upon someone, you can have this cheat sheet available for them to point to and say, this is my language. And now you know if you need to get some other type of service for them, you have an idea of what language it is that you need to go ahead and get. And I think that, that's another way of helping to break the ice and make people feel comfortable when you're dealing with immigrant populations. A little bit goes a long way with any of the clients that I've ever dealt with, whether it's their names or just something very basic. It really goes a long way, and folks really appreciate just that little bit of a step that we can take. Okay, so one of the things that I have experienced is dealing with cultural differences. And I know that you guys have probably heard a lot of things about cultural competency. If you're new or if you've been working in this area for years, you've probably heard, the phrase thrown around all the time. And, when I was preparing, I saw that there are more than 7,000 languages spoken in the world today. That's a lot of languages. And even within one language, there are a lot of differentiations. And so, in this context, the majority of the clients that I deal with speak some form of Spanish. But what I've learned is, Spanish isn't just Spanish. It can depend on where the person comes from. And even within one country, for example, within Spain, there are different types of Spanish. So, it is also understanding that when you are dealing with immigrants, that there may be some of those cultural differences that you're dealing with. I think the other issue that has come up more often than I was prepared for when I first started doing this work was clients that were either fully or functionally illiterate. And just because a client speaks a particular language doesn't mean that they can actually read or write in that language. And the clients that I have worked with that have been illiterate or functionally illiterate, were often too embarrassed in the beginning to tell me that they were unable to read or write. And so I had to learn to look for clues. And as time went on, things became more evident to me about the clues. So, for example, example, if a client said, well, I'll have my daughter read it to me when she gets home, if I sent them a letter. That was a good clue to me that, okay, perhaps even though the letter I'm sending may be in their language, whether it's Spanish or some other language, that they're not able to read it, or they're not able to read it meaningfully for them. I would sometimes have clients that were here in the office, and if they are reading something that I've given them, I could look at them and see that they weren't actually reading. You don't see their eyes moving back and forth across the page. They're kind of just looking at it and kind of looking, there's a blank line, and I think I need to sign on this line, but I'm not exactly sure what I'm supposed to do. And and noticing those little cues and those little things. And then once I've realized it, taking the time to talk with them and to help them understand that I am not in any way judging them, and I understand that they have some difficulties, but I'm here to help. So if I need to read it or have someone read it with them, take more time to explain things with them, that it is absolutely okay. I've also come into situations where there is a particular language called Mixteco, and there's a large Mixteco population in Wilson County in Lebanon, Tennessee, and there's a large Mixteco population in northern Alabama. Now, many Mixteco speakers learn Spanish as a crossover language so they can get around and get groceries and talk to neighbors and those types of things, but it's not their first language. And although they may speak Spanish, they may not be able to read or write Spanish. And this can create a difficulty because Mixteco has no written language. So you can run into situations where there's even no way to write something down for a particular client. And it's just trying to make whatever it is you're trying to impart to them, whether it's explaining about shelter rules or protection order hearing, it's trying to make it as meaningful and as reasonable for them as possible. And I think one of the things that I ran into with a Mixteco speaker was in Mixteco, as you can see from the PowerPoint, there's no word for sex. So if you're doing a consultation, in my case, or in your case, if you're doing an intake or you're trying to, talk to a client about counseling services and you believe that this person may have been sexually assaulted, how do you ask them if they've been sexually assaulted, even if you're speaking in Spanish, when there's no word for sex in their native language? So sometimes you have to find creative ways of having these conversations with your clients and with the survivors that you're working with. I have in some circumstances had to ask someone, were you forced to have intimate relations? I've had our advocate, has asked, making babies, or, getting really creative when you're trying to deal with the differences between languages. And then you can also run into situations where in someone's language, for example, I had a client from an Eastern European country, and where in that client's culture, it was considered extremely rude to talk about sex. And so it's trying to be creative to find a way, all right, how do we talk about this without me, offending this person that's come to me for services. And for me, I try and take time out in the beginning of the conversation to kind of establish a little bit of a rapport or a relationship and make people comfortable and kind of explain to them that I understand that we're going to talk about some difficult things, and that my purpose for asking these questions is strictly to be helpful, is strictly to determine if there's something that I can do to help them. And I'm sure that you guys probably do the same thing in your daily work, of helping to make folks feel comfortable when they're telling you something that's tragic, when they're telling you something that's embarrassing, or in their culture could be humiliating. But I have found that just going that extra step for our limited English proficient clients can really go a long way. When I have taken that extra step, I end up getting a lot more information, and information that's helpful to me to do what I need to do, which is, provide a consultation or help them fill out some documents. And so that in the long run really benefits me and what I'm doing. And, I also think that sometimes some of the things that we may often forget in dealing with limited English proficient clients, and dealing with culture differences, is that the culture differences can be more than just the person's language. It can include food, it can include clothing, it can include hygiene or products, or a variety of things. And it is continuing to be sensitive to that and help explain to the clients that we're working with and understand. And I think that for many of the limited English proficient clients that I work with, oftentimes they may be hesitant to express any type of disagreement. And that, as many of you I'm sure are familiar with, can be related to trauma, and a lot of different things. Dealing with LEPs, limited English proficient clients, is no different in that, but it does add one other level when you're dealing with someone who, the language is different, the culture is different, and they may not have the same words, or the words may not even mean the exact same thing when you're dealing with someone who's limited English proficient. I guess, is there a way for me to find out how many of you guys are working with the court? How many of you guys go to court?
If you can just answer in your chat or question box, just type in there if you go to court, if that's something that you all do within your agency. We'll give you a second to answer.
Wow, looks like there's a lot of you guys that do court work. That is awesome. That's wonderful to see. Awesome. And Martisha is doing court advocacy and translating. Awesome. So I think that's one other area where, and I'm sure that you guys have many stories just like I do, about the court. And when someone is going to court, due process requires a person to have meaningful access. That means free. That means timely. And I know that it can be difficult when you guys are trying to advocate for your clients. You guys are being zealous advocates for your client. And it can be difficult because if you need to get an interpreter, that might push a case back. You may have to reschedule something. And you may be dealing with judges who may not necessarily be as open to postponing things for your client to have an interpreter there in court if there's not one that's already readily available. I think what's important, and I'm sure many of you guys are probably already aware of this and you get this on a daily basis, is if they can't understand the process, they can't participate in the process. And when you're thinking about this, one of the things that, I would encourage you guys to do is the court has more resources than any of our programs do. They have money for interpreters and translators. And if you are in a particular jurisdiction where you are having issues with getting translators or interpreters in particular languages, or it's been very difficult, or you're running up against a lot of barriers in doing that, then I strongly suggest that you contact the AOC, the Administrative Office of the Courts, and let them know. I can't tell you how many times that I have heard horror stories about someone being in court and not having access to an interpreter to understand what's going on. And I had someone tell me about a judge that asked basically asked a simple question in English, and because the woman was able to answer a basic question in English, assumed, well, she can speak English, so we don't need an interpreter, and we're just going to move on with this case. And I guess I think about that in my own context, where, I'm sure many of us can understand some basic foreign language. I think most of us probably understand, a couple of phrases in Spanish, hola, buenos dias, cómo está. That doesn't mean you can speak Spanish. That means you understand, hello, good morning, how are you? The pleasantries, but that doesn't mean that you can meaningfully speak another language. And it was just unfortunate in that circumstance that was the role and the attitude that the judge took, because the client could understand some basic English. And understanding basic English does not mean that they are going to be able to meaningfully participate in due process, or have due process and meaningfully participate in the process that's going on, whether it's the criminal court, whether it's the protection order, because it is not having that meaningful access is going to keep, someone from truly being able to express themselves and what's going on. And I'm sure many of you probably have many similar stories, if not worse, of things that you've seen and heard go on in court. All right, so one other thing that I learned, and this was a good one for me, was learning about if you're dealing with a limited English proficient client and you are working with an interpreter, understanding interpretation is difficult. We have 2 Spanish speakers here on staff in our office, and I am constantly impressed and amazed at their ability to do what they do. And there's 2 types of interpretation. So one is simultaneous, and if you think about, if you've ever watched, folks at the UN or at Congress, and they're sitting there and they have headphones on, that's simultaneous. So they're never hearing what the person in the foreign language is saying. The headphones block all of that out, and all they hear is their own language. That's it. But what we're doing on, a daily or weekly or whatever basis is what's called continuous. And what that means is that every time I say something, my advocate has to remember what I'm saying, word for word, try and translate it into the foreign language, and then tell the client exactly what I said. And doing that can be difficult because as I've learned over the years, some things there is no exact translation for certain things that you say. And so your translator or interpreter may have to have a little bit of license in explaining something when there's no word for word translation. But what I have found that has been beneficial for me, for my advocate, and for the client is speaking in short sentences, keeping things basic as we can, and realizing that some of the words that we use, it can be difficult to explain to someone a court process. And so if we're able to break it down to them in short bits, I have found that it has been very helpful for the clients and the folks that I work with. I think one of the other things that I have come to understand and appreciate over the years is that many of my clients come from areas of the world where a court is just a formality. It's not effective. It doesn't really work. They don't do anything to help you. And so they may have an idea of, there's no purpose to this. There's no point to this. So you sometimes have an additional hurdle that you're trying to overcome in dealing with, your immigrant clients and, LEP clients that you're working with. Is dealing with that. And I do also, although this is focusing on immigrants, I do also want to stress that limited English proficient isn't necessarily an immigrant. Limited English proficient can also be somebody that speaks English. So it's also something to keep in mind, as we're working with folks, that it's not necessarily just the immigrant clients that you're working with, is that it could also be some English speakers that you're working with. And just to kind of give you guys an example of when I am having a consultation or talking with a client and trying to talk with them a little bit about their experience and what they've gone through, one of the things that clients often have confusion in understanding is the difference between a protection order hearing and the criminal hearing. I can often ask clients, well, did you go to court? And they can say they went to court, but when I try to differentiate between, did you go to court for this assault or did you go to court for the protection order, they often are confused and don't realize that in some jurisdictions there are two different hearings. In some jurisdictions they may get combined into one hearing, and so they often don't know. And are very confused about it. And so that just goes back to, taking the approach of trying to break things down as simply as possible. And it also goes back to what I said earlier about clients who might be illiterate or functionally illiterate. When you're dealing with those limited English proficient clients, is watching for those cues and whether or not they are truly understanding what you're saying and how you're trying to help them. And one of the things I often will do with clients where I'm concerned that they're not truly understanding what I'm saying is I'll ask them, can you repeat back? Can you explain back to me what I've said so that I can help make sure that they understand what's going on and what needs to happen? Okay, so with me being the immigration attorney, I want to make sure that you guys are fully aware and understand you have no obligation whatsoever or any responsibility to contact ICE about any undocumented person that comes to you for services. Okay, and ICE stands for Immigration Customs Enforcement, if you guys don't know. And those are the people that come around and do raids and pick people up for deportation and put them into detention. There's no obligation at all under anything that I'm aware of, any law or regulation that you guys need to do that. Immigration status should not be a factor when we're dealing with survivors and victims. And for many of you, if you're already dealing with limited English proficient immigrant clients, you already know that, the fact that that client is probably undocumented, has its own challenges. These folks are usually not authorized legally to work in the United States, which creates challenges for them and for you guys when you're trying to assist them, whether it's with housing, with transitional housing, jobs, work, a variety of things. What even driving can be difficult. One other thing that I wanted to talk with you guys about is to let you guys know that when you're dealing with someone that is undocumented, being undocumented does not necessarily mean that the person is illegal. So you may hear a lot of, we want illegal immigration, illegal immigration. What happens is if a person is in the U.S. and they are without documents, meaning they don't have a visa or some lawful way to be here in the U.S., they're violating civil immigration laws. Some of the laws may have a criminal penalty, but it often will depend on how that person came into the U.S. So, for example, a person who actually entered the U.S. illegally, so say it is someone who crossed a border, whether it's the Mexican border or the Canadian border, they crossed the border illegally. That person may have criminal penalties. But say you've got a person who came here as a student. They got into a relationship, the relationship became abusive. Because of the abuse, they stopped going to school, they lost their student status. That person does not have a criminal penalty. So it is a more complicated circumstance and situation than many people may think when they just hear the phrase illegal. One of the other things that I've learned over the years that I've been doing this is that just to encourage you guys, but also to caution you guys that as you're helping your client, and I know that, we often go above and beyond when we're helping the clients that we're serving, is to be careful if you are helping an undocumented person in applying for benefits such as food stamps or public housing. Undocumented immigrants are generally not eligible for any public benefits, but as I'm sure many of you are aware, US-born children may be eligible for benefits. But you can run into circumstances where they may want the parent to have a Social Security number. The parent's not going to have a valid Social Security number. So if that's a requirement of the application, then they're not going to be able to apply. And I think another reason this situation came up, and I was very surprised working with an advocate, I don't know, maybe a year or two ago, and the advocate was, doing her utmost to help this undocumented family get into, to get some housing and to get into public housing. And unfortunately, there was a person at that agency who wanted to refer this person to ICE. So I think that it is also important for you guys. You guys know your community. You guys know who you're working with. And so just to keep that in mind, and I will say this advocate did above and beyond to protect her client, and it worked out great in the end. But it definitely, I believe, was challenging and a little bit scary for a while of what's going to happen. So if you've got those limited English proficient immigrant clients that you're working with and they turn out to be undocumented, just keep that in mind as you're going to move forward with them if you're going to assist them in applying for public benefits. Okay, so resources. So yes, and I did put laugh out loud and ha ha ha, because if your programs are like ours, resources are strapped, are limited, and the fact that many of us are grant funded, it forces us to get creative in how we serve clients, and that includes the immigrant clients. These are a couple of websites, like I've already told you about the Australian website, but some other websites that might be able to help you guys with, free translations, interpretation. Organizations like Pro Bono Speaks is a group that is developed strictly to help folks with translation and interpretation for free. You just have to apply to them, tell them what your circumstances are, and see if they're able to help. I also have other ideas that I've thought of over the years and things that we've done. And the reason is because, to give you an example, we all realize some of these services are expensive. It's expensive to get brochures in a variety of languages. It's expensive to get whether it's know your rights information or other information in other languages, or to try and even have somebody on staff that speaks a language or have access. I know our office here, we use a phone service called Language Line. So when we have folks that speak other languages than Spanish, or even Spanish, if our advocate is out, we can contact Language Line, and they can provide the language service. But I was working with an asylum client a few months ago, and in 1 month, we spent over $400 on phone translation, and we could not afford to do that. And so that resource limitation forced me to rethink my communication with her. What other options do I have to communicate with her and still provide the access she needs, the help she needs, and get everything that I needed from her in order to help her with her immigration application. And so, it got me to thinking about looking at your local or your state court certified translator list. Who's on the list, and would any of those people be willing to provide, free or low cost or even contract services? To say, hey, as needed, if we have an emergency, can we call you and you set up, maybe a flat rate in advance? It's made me think about, do you have a college nearby? Do they teach Spanish or some other language at that college? Is there a professor at that college that speaks another language or is from another country or another culture that might be willing to offer up a little bit of time in an emergency situation? We've also utilized in the past someone from the local school. So if you've got high school, if you've got a counselor or a resource person at the school that might speak another language, sometimes those folks might be willing to provide a little bit of emergency translation to you if you need it, and something that you can set up in advance. There was a situation where I had a client that spoke a language, and I couldn't find anybody, but what ended up happening is I found somebody at a church, and I found a pastor at a church who spoke the language. And the pastor, and we went through all of the checks and made sure there were no conflicts and confidentiality and all of those things and the client was okay with using the pastor, and the pastor was able to provide some much needed translation services for that client. So depending on where you guys live, what your jurisdiction is like, what your community is like, you just sometimes have to think outside the box, and those are just some ideas for you to think outside the box of if you don't have somebody readily available, and this goes back to that just in case plan. These are the folks that you have just in case, and to say, hey, would you be willing to do this and help us out just in case we have a client that speaks Vietnamese? So I wanted to skip through. Go back. So I do want to provide some good time for questions and comments from you guys, but I wanted to give you guys the contact information, and I'll be happy to provide the PowerPoint to you guys. So if you guys want the PowerPoint, you guys can let me know. You can contact me or you can contact Heather, and we can make sure to get you guys a PowerPoint. I do want to let you guys know that, we've got 2 clinics here at the coalition. So we have our immigration clinic, which I'm the full-time attorney in that clinic. And then we have our advocate, who is Ana Garcia, is the advocate. And, we do immigration for victims and survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, human trafficking. But we also have our civil legal clinic is back up and running, and we have a new attorney, and his name is Chad Butler. And they've got a Spanish-speaking advocate in that clinic, and that's Myra Frias. And then they have a legal secretary, Megan Batista. And you guys can give them a call. They have a great clinic, and what they do in their clinic is they are able to assist sexual assault victims that are 12 years and older, and they're able to assist with the civil litigation. So as you see up there, protection orders, divorces, custody. If it was a sexual assault at work and now there's an employment issue going on, that's something that they can deal with. For those of you in university areas, if it was a sexual assault on campus and there's an on-campus hearing and they need an attorney, that's something that they can deal with in that clinic. So if you guys come upon that kind of circumstance, or even if you're not sure, I say give us a call. It's always better to give us a call, and we'll try and work through it and figure out whether the person is eligible or not. And if we are not able to assist someone, we generally have some referral information that we can provide, hopefully to somebody that's in your area or your area that might be able to provide you with some additional assistance. All right. And that said, I know we've got a couple of minutes left, about 10 minutes. So, and I talk a little bit fast. That could just be the lawyer in me used to talking fast, which is fine. But I did want to make sure to give you guys time so that if you guys have questions, comments, concerns, go ahead and type them, like Heather said, type them into your chat box. They will pop up, and I'd love to take a couple of minutes and answer any questions that you guys might have. All right, well, it looks like you guys are awesome and don't have any questions. So if there are no questions, then this will be the end of our webinar for today. Again, if you guys do want a copy of the PowerPoint, please feel free to contact me or Heather. I'll be happy to provide that to you guys. If you guys have any questions about, folks that you serve, aha! All right, do I know of any cell phone apps that we could use for translation or interpretation? I will get that information for you. I have heard about that, and I will see if I can get some information from a colleague that I work with for a translation or interpretation. Vanessa and I will make sure to get back to you about that information. All right, and again, if anybody wants the PowerPoint, I'll be happy to provide that.
This is Heather. I'm going to send you all, after the fact, I will be sending out your certificates of attendance as well as a link to the recording of today's webinar. And I'll just go ahead and have Stephanie send the PowerPoint to me. That way I can just send it out to everyone when I send you your certificates. That way you can all have it, and it's there if you need it.
All right, well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you guys taking the time today and spending about an hour with me and being patient with me as I do my first webinar. So I hope you guys all have a wonderful day, and you guys know where we are if you guys have any questions or need anything. So thank you so much.